Welcome back. In this section we're going to start creating our very first shaders. But before we do that, what I want to do is create a new startup file that has lighting setup, a background, a camera. It's essentially ready to go to just apply a material to an object in the scene and start working to create our materials. So the first thing I want to do is get this startup file ready to go. So I'm just going to cover the very basics. First of all, let's get our geometry in order. So we have this sphere, or this ecosphere in the scene. I'm just going to hit G and Z and move this up a little bit. Let's get these shortcut keys turned on as well. So I want to have a plane on the ground that then curves up and creates a background. So I'm going to hit Shift A, select a plane. I'm going to go into edit mode, and in the top view I'm just going to move some of these verts around a little bit. So I'll zoom out a little bit. I've got my selection box tool enabled. I'm going to click and drag and select these top verts and just move these back a bit. So I'm just using G and then Y to move those back. We'll do the same with the bottom ones, G and then Y. Now I want to move all the verts out the way, so I'm going to scale up, but instead of scaling everything up, I'm just going to scale in X. I'm going to hit X. Now what I want to do is I want to grab an edge. So next to our drop down menu for our different modes, I'm going to select the edge mode. I'm going to click on this back edge, and then I'm going to hit E to extrude this up. So extrude will create this new face, and I'm going to hit Z to make sure that goes straight up in the air. And I'll take it up to about here. So now we have this floor plane and this background, but I don't want to have a sharp angle in here. I want to create a nice curved angle connecting these. So I'm going to grab that edge again, and now we're going to use the bevel tool. I'm going to use the hotkey Control B to bevel that, and I want it to be very smooth. You can see I'm getting this angle. If I roll my mouse wheel, you can see that I can create some more geometry in there. So I'm just going to create enough geometry so I get a nice smooth curve. So something like that should be fine. And now what I want to do is I want to move my camera into place. So I'm going to select my camera. I'm going to hit 0 to look through it. Now we've used this trick before. We go to View, lock camera to view, and then we can move our camera into place to have our object basically taking up the entirety of that viewport. So let's get it to about there. We'll turn off lock camera to view. Now what I do want to do is I want to select my camera. I'm going to item, and we have to make sure we're in object mode for this. Now what we can do is we can just adjust some of these settings. So at the moment we have location almost at 0. I'm going to just type in 0 there. We have Y, so this is how far away we are from our object. I think that's okay about there. Let's just move it down a little bit to center that object. Now our rotation is almost straight on. Let's actually make that straight on by going to 90 degrees. And then we can lower this down again. Our Y rotation is almost at 0, so let's just type in 0. And the same with the Z, that's very close to 0. So again, we'll type in 0. And our object is centered in our camera. I think I'm pretty happy with that. So we've got our camera set up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lock all the rotations and location information on our camera. So now if we're in camera mode and we try and move, we can't do that. We select our camera and then we try and move that. We also can't do that. So our camera's locked in our scene. Our object, I'm also going to lock in the scene. So I'll just lock all the transforms, and on our background as well, we can just lock that as well. So now there's nothing in the scene that we can move apart from things like our lights. We're going to adjust those in a little bit. Our background still has some facets, so I'm going to right click and shade auto smooth. Let's look through our camera view. So we need to check our lighting at this point. So you'll remember before that when we were in rendered mode, we get only our scene lights. But what we want to do is we want to maybe turn off scene world and have one of these HDRIs. Now this one seems okay, but there's not much happening in it. So we can click on this and we can choose something else. Let's try this indoor one. So we're getting some nice bounce lights and things. That's okay. Let's add an additional light into our scene. So let's move this a little bit. Now what might be useful here is if we split our screen. So I'm just going to click and drag, or you can click on the top bar and split vertically. So I want to have my camera view in here. And let's zoom right in on that. Get rid of these toolbars by hitting T and N. And now let's just look at this view. And again, let's get rid of that toolbar. And let's take this light and let's move it a little bit closer to our object. So you can see as we get closer to our object, it's changing the shadow on the ground. Let's go into our top view and move this back a little bit. So we are getting a nice shadow. So I want the shadow to start around about here. And this is a nice bright white light. Let's duplicate this light object by hitting Shift D and move this over to the other side. And on this light, I want to give it a little bit of colour. So I'm going to go down to my light options here in the properties panel. And we have colour here. And let's just change this over a little bit. Let's just give it a slight kind of pinkish purplish colour. And I think that looks pretty good there. We just want to give it a slight tint. Let's grab this main light and let's also give this a slight tint. Let's just bring it slightly towards a kind of yellowish light. Not too much, just a little bit. Okay, so now we've added an extra viewport to our layout workspace, but we want to close that by hitting the top bar and going to close area. Now we can return to our procedural shading vertical workspace and we can make some changes. So we'll first of all make some space, go to rendered mode. We'll click 0 on the number pad to go to the camera view, and now we can work on our scene lighting. We don't have our scene world set up. This is just our default lighting. Let's turn that on. Let's go into our render settings on the properties panel and change over to cycles, GPU compute, and we'll also turn on denoising. Our background, which I'm going to click on, we want to add a new material to that. And what I want to do is just give this a kind of mid-grey material. Maybe just past mid-grey, a bit darker than that, and quite a lot of roughness on it. And that looks pretty good. I'm going to select my object. Let's just make it a little bit smoother by adding a subdivision surface onto it. And that looks pretty good. Let's maybe just squeeze this down a little bit more. In our camera view, I don't like the fact that I'm still seeing some of the background here. But in our camera settings, viewport display, and turn up this opaque part out all the way up, so we can black out everything that we don't see. Now with our object selected, we have the ability to add a new material onto that. But this is us pretty much set up ready to start adding materials to this object. So at this point, I'm going to hit File, Save As, and I want to save this. So I'm just going to put this on my desktop for the moment. I'm just going to call this Material Template. Now if I want, I could set this up as my new startup file. I think for the moment I will do that, but that's entirely up to you. It just means that if I close down Blender and then open it up again, we're going to be directly in this scene again. Everything is going to be set up the way we left it. Cycles, GPU, material ready to go, our background, our lighting. And that's the way I'm going to work in this. So you will have access to this file, so you can start off exactly the same way as me. Okay, challenge time. So your challenge is to create an object in a backdrop. Now you may already have a default object in there. You may be using the sphere the way I am, or the default cube, but you can add any object you want. You can even try the monkey head. Next, move your camera to fill the camera view with your object with a nice composition and lock that into place. Next, set up your lighting to use that default HDRI. You can use whichever default HDRI you want. Just remember to turn off Scene World when you're in render mode to access that. set up your render preferences. So make sure if you're using Eevee, it's set to Eevee, and if you're using Cycles, that's set up as well, and you are using your GPU. And whether you want to turn on denoising or not, that's up to you. So save that startup file. You can make it your new startup file, or you can just keep it in a folder. We are going to be using a variation of this file for our material library in the next video. And once you've done that, we'll move on to the next video. See you then.